Welcome. Thanks for coming. I want to thank Barbara, Jim Grant, Gary Wong, and Penny for participating. I went to Chenard Art Institute in Los Angeles, and we have a Terry Allen's here from Chenard. Larry Bell was there, Ed Rocher was there, Alan Rupersberg was there, Jim Grant was there, Jun Kaneko was there, Gary Wong was there. It was a great place. It was a great time. And John Copeland's, who became the editor of Art Forum magazine, a South African artist actually, was teaching a class in contemporary art history. And he asked me if I would take him out and show him some of the cool art students' work and studios. And I said, yeah, and we had a date and went out, and I took him around and introduced him to some people. And at the end of the evening, probably about 8 o'clock, we pulled up to a storefront where Santa Monica Boulevard runs into Sunset Boulevard. And right there was a little storefront. Knocked on the door, and it was Judy Garowitz, who's now Judy Chicago, Lloyd Hammerl, her partner at the time. They were both hosting Ron Davis, 64, who had just come down from San Francisco. That's when I met Ron. At that time, Terry O'Shea and I were making work out of resin and fiberglass, and Ron was having a problem. He was doing these canvases and laying down gesso and sanding them, and these fibers would be sticking up, driving him crazy. So I said, well, why don't you just put a coat of resin on it? That'll keep that stuff down. And that was the beginning of his actual working with resin. And it turns out that I have the first piece that he did with that. It was a really beautiful piece. When he came to, we did a lot of hanging out together in the 60s. Had some interesting times with Lamont Young and Marion Zazila coming out from New York, doing amplifier tonal intersection pieces. They were working with Panda Prannath, who's an interesting Indian singer who I kind of hung out in New York and went to a couple of his events. Ron was into electronic music, and that was one of the really cool evenings in his studio. But when he got to Taos, immediately we reconnected. So, Barbara.
Thank you, Ron. I'm Barbara. And picking up from that thread, I was introduced to Ron Davis by a mutual friend with whom I had come out here to New Mexico from Maryland. She was an art student, and she and I used to skip class to go to the National Gallery to look at art, and that was where I sort of got my first look at modern art and was blown away. And ironically, we both moved, she and I, this friend, both moved to New Mexico around the same time, and she met Ron first, and she introduced me to Ron. She told me, there's this cool guy who lives up on the mesa in Arroyo Hondo, and he's got this interesting set of buildings, and he's doing 3D animation, and he knows a bunch about computers. And she took me out there to meet Ron about these topics. And I was blown away, as everyone is, when they see the buildings that Ron built here when he moved here from Malibu. Buildings that are based on the Navajo Hogan idiom, and they all face east. There are 7 buildings, and they're wonderful. And so Ron, long story short, Ron and I became friends. We helped each other on the computer. One of the first people Ron took me to meet and get to know was Ron Cooper and Sandra Lerner. We went to dinner, and it was a whole new world for me. It was just great to meet these new people, this particular art community. And that was something that came up last night. This is quite a community, the arts community. Here in Santa Fe, up in Taos, from LA, the threads and the connections are many and very moving when I hear about them and when we hear about them. Ron passed away in November of 2025, and for the couple of years prior, actually 3 years, it sort of started toward the end of COVID, he began this new series, and he really wanted to go back to acrylic on canvas. And he sat and thought, he studied and looked at different things. He had a book of Navajo art that he borrowed from Charles Cambridge, who was the anthropologist, the Dene anthropologist who helped Dennis Holloway and Ron build the buildings in Arroyo Hondo here in New Mexico. And this book had a lot of pictures of shields and circular objects, circular drawings and items and paintings. And Ron really looked at those a lot and studied those. And he also looked at color, and he looked at Mondrian, and he studied for many months on his own. And we talked about it, just talked about everything. And finally he said, you know, Barbara, I'm going to order some circular canvases, and I need to find the center. He wanted to find the center. So he found the center for many pieces, and was inspired by the color that he lived in his whole life. And he decided to turn the backings of them on edge at 45 degrees because it helped with the objectivity of the pieces. Because he felt that if they were only circles on the wall by themselves, that they would not be protected enough. And so he found the Mondrian story of how Mondrian took a square painting that he had on the wall and turned it on its edge, and it became a different object. It changed the nature of it. It became an object rather than just a picture. So that's the story of these paintings. And he kept it up for 3 years, just continuing to build on this series. And he strong-armed pain and illness to the end to do this. And we were here in Santa Fe at a doctor's appointment, and Ron said, let's swing by Charlotte's gallery. So we swung by, and I got him in here, and he showed Charlotte something that he had in the truck that we had brought with us. It was one of these smaller circular paintings on a 45-degree angled backing. And he said, Charlotte, I'm doing this work, and I have a whole bunch of them. Will you give me a show? And Charlotte said, sure. And I didn't expect that. That was a great gift. So that was the driving final factor. It's like, she's going to do it. She's going to give me a show. Because he really wanted this venue, this gallery, this audience to be able to see this work here in Santa Fe. And we did it. We did it.
About a month before Ron passed away, he said, I want to do a panel, and I want you to be on the panel and talk about the old days, the good old days. So I said, okay. Well, he's not around, but I promised I'd be on the panel, so here I am.
Thank you for that. I forgot that part. I'm so sorry. But that's why we're here, and it's a great gift. And thanks to Charlotte, thanks to...
Yeah, we're the old guys.
Yeah. Right, and I hang around with old guys, so it works out. I like to hang around with the old guys. So, yeah, so thank you for that. And if, later there will be question and answer period if anybody has any questions. So thank you.
Hey, Jim,
Yes, hi.
will you talk about working with Ron?
Okay, I was going to go back to when I first met Ron, but I think I'll start with my impressions here today and yesterday of seeing Ron's work for the first time in the reality. I've seen reproductions and they go so far, but there's nothing like the presence of the object. You see it in its space and scale and things that you just can't get from photographs. And one of the things that became aware to me was his influence from the Native American direction. And looking at the one that's behind us and the one that's on the far wall to the right, I see an influence from Kachinas and his awareness of their structures and their just their graphics and also the colors. And then others I see is attention to the color relationships and how he's balancing hot and cool and complements and just the kind of awareness of color and composition of colors that Ron is so much a master of. So those are my immediate impressions from this visit. Going back to the history, I think I first met Ron perhaps at his first show at Nicholas Wilder Gallery in the 60s. And like many, I was a student at Chenard, and I had been away from I'd gone through all the classes I wanted to take, and I was out on my own in my own studio, and I was experimenting with plastics. I'm not sure what the chronology is as to who started it, but I was aware of the material and trying to see what I could do with it. And also, my neighbor in the loft building where I was living was Bill Pettit, and he was a friend of Ron's, a close friend, and Ron was influenced by his work, and they influenced each other. So that combination got me to the Nicholas Wilder show, and perhaps I met Ron then. I can't be sure exactly, but that's good enough, close enough. So anyway,
Doug Wheeler was a neighbor.
we became friends.
Wasn't Doug Wheeler a neighbor as well? Didn't Doug Wheeler have a loft space near you, Pettit, near you?
Not hearing well.
Doug Wheeler?
What about Doug?
Doug Weaver. No. Actually, no.
What was the question?
Was Doug Wheeler involved? I think. I don't remember him strongly. I mean, I know him from Chenard, and
They were going different ways.
we were not close friends. Just students together at the time.
But he had a loft studio next to Bill Pettit.
Well, I didn't know him at that point.
Okay.
So,
Not on Jefferson and Maine.
yeah, I don't remember him living near Jefferson, Maine. I had originally a studio down in Venice, and that got sold, and I had to move and find another place. And
Where was Ron before Pico and Fourth Ave?
I think it was on Melrose somewhere. It was somewhere in Hollywood. And Ron had a much smaller studio than the one that he had on Pico. And actually, and he was working with Richard Jacomi, another fellow Chenard student, and Richard was helping him make his early resin paintings.
Richard said he was sorry he couldn't make it. He's at a retirement place down by Long Beach, but he doesn't go out anymore, so
Not that he
he
goes
said
out
to say,
So,
well, tell us about working with Ron with resin.
well, after we'd become friends for quite a while, he needed help making his large paintings, and I needed to earn a living. And so he hired me to help him make them. And this was at the time when he had made, I think, most of the dodecagons, but he was still working with shaped canvases. We made the resin ones for a while. I guess some of the later dodecagons I did work on. But during that time, he transitioned to making them out of a different kind of more flexible resin and attaching them to the wall with Velcro. And he liked that effect because it got rid of the support entirely. And as he put it, it was like putting a decal on the wall with the minimum of attention to structure. And so everything became the painting, the image, and the perspective. And that was the most important thing. And we had wonderful conversations along the way, apart from just the labor of making the paintings. We talked about art historical origins and Paolo Uccello and his original development of perspective and the images that were in the paintings. Uccello had made images of something that I think it's called a masaccio, but it's a headdress that was in contemporary Italian culture at the time, and it was for men. It was sort of a circular affair, or a support for a circular affair, covered with fabric, but it was in the same structure as the dodecagons, only more complex. And Ron was fascinated by that, and I think there were some chalices and other objects that were circular that Ron studied.
Hogans.
Well, no, Hogans had not shown up, and they were not on the horizon at that point. And other artists that we just had wide-ranging conversations about art in general, and we would smoke some reefers and go off on all kinds of tangents, that wherever our interests led us. So it was a wonderful time, and I have great memories from it. We need another segue.
Did you ever play chess with Ron? He told me that the first order of business was to play chess and smoke reefer and then get to work.
Well, no, I wasn't part of the chess. But definitely a part of the reefers.
Well, Gary, what do you got to say?
Nothing.
Well, look, I
I was introduced to Ron through his first paintings that were shown at Nick Wilder Gallery, which was a real important gallery in Los Angeles in that there was no real galleries outside of the Ferris Gallery. We know as the famous Los Angeles gallery that showed a lot of famous guys and did some really great shows and used a lot of local artists. But it kind of got a real full stable real quick, and the center of it was Art Forum, John Copeland's, Philip Leader, Jules Langsner, brainiacs, art brainiacs who were Greenbergian and conceptual and all about art making and formalism and approaches to art and contemporary thinking. A lot of Black Mountain College stuff. I don't know if you all are familiar with that. But there was a direct connection to our art school with Black Mountain in that we had instructors that went there, and the philosophies and the thinking like a creative person in whatever it is that you choose to create. Because Black Mountain, there was some of everybody in there, making music, performance. So this gallery started showing, not Ferris now. This gallery opened up across the street, directly across the street from Ferris, called the Nick Wilder Gallery. Nicholas Wilder came down from San Francisco, and he was a young guy that had this vision, which was to meld East Coast and West Coast formal artists that were young and up and coming, and presented to Los Angeles, which was in need of a formal introduction to the tradition that we know today of American art forms. And I'm talking about all the art forms, not just painting. But having said that, that kind of like setting the stage for my introduction to Ron Davis. And, you know, I've not met these guys in school. So I go to Nick Wilder's gallery, and one of his early shows was a group show that was kind of the expression of what I just explained, which was to bring together young East Coast and West Coast artists. What I remember was Jules Olitsky, Ken Nolan, Larry Poons, Ron Davis, Larry Bell. Oh God, it goes on and on and on, doesn't it? But you see, there's West Coast and East Coast stuff going on. I think Ken Nolan, Frank Stella. So that whole new dialogue was opening up in Los Angeles, and Ron was right in there, and Bill Pettit as well. They became part of the new avant that was having exhibitions and creating in that gallery a real scene. There was no real scene, but eventually other galleries popped up, more artists were being exposed, and then LA was then creating an identity. What I wanted to get at was the search that artists have. Usually is expressed in the materials that they use. In Ron Davis's is an American painter who, on a formal level, can be, whether you agree with or not, a Greenbergian artist, which then identifies first and second generation New York school artists who were the first generation abstract expressionists that hung out at the Cedar Bar. All of the stories. Maurice Tuckman in Los Angeles became the modern curator for the new Pasadena Art Museum. Walter Hopps. Maurice Tuckman was the director. Well, but the Pasadena Art Museum. Walter Hopps curated the show.
That was Walter, yeah.
Right, but Maurice Tuckman was the director. Oh, at the county, yes, I'm sorry, you're right.
Tuckman was at.
No, you're right,
Yeah.
I got mixed up. With Maurice Tuckman, he became the first director of modern art for the county and produced, the first show was the New York School, the first generation of New York artists, which I was a first-year art student at Chenard. It just knocked me out. I don't know anybody else that saw that show, but I was there, and it knocked me out. I fell in love with it. Did you see that show? It traveled. I had the poster. That's all I could afford. And it had a catalog, and then the critique was like this, and Philip Leader wrote the critique on the show, one of my.
Catalog.
Pardon?
The catalog for the show?
No, this was for the Times or Art,
okay,
no,
right.
for Art Forum or something like that. He wrote
Well, he probably wrote, Phil Leader was writing for Art Forum, so that's probably.
well, that's,
Probably wrote it out.
anyway, he wrote the thing. And, but Ron is, now we place him in the pantheon of American abstract, traditional formal approach to painting. And I want to emphasize painting because Ron is foremost by and far a painter. Now, my first introduction to him was his painting, Zigzag.
Roll Your Own Zigzag.
Well,
That's the title.
I didn't care for the painting, but it did leave an impression. It was shaped, it was a spiral on canvas. That was unique. I didn't care for that, but I was into everything, but it left an impression. The impression though was, this dude's from San Francisco, he must be a pot smoker. Zigzag. So I was introduced to Ron through his painting. Now I see return to canvas as like coming home and finding your expression. You make it real again. And you've gone through all the permutations of your career with this material and that material, trying to make it work with your vision. And you always come back home. Whether chickens come home to roost and all that stuff. But so I went from canvas to canvas, and then there's all the plastic and everything else, the pixie dust and everything in the middle. My real introduction to the Ron Davis as a person, he lived up the street from me on the block. He moved to Pico on 4th Avenue. I lived on 4th Avenue, a block away. But I didn't know Ron. I just knew that he was a pothead, But Richard Yacomi lived a block away as well, and he was Ron's first assistant. And I knew Richard because I'd take him to the racetrack, and we'd bet horses. One day Richard says, "There's a guy over here that smokes pot." I said, "Yeah. Can you get him some?" I said, "No problem." Said, well, you know, he's over here in the studio, blah, blah, blah. No, I take a dime bag over there. I have access. I took it over there. I met Ron. We sat down, smoked fatty, and had a dialogue that lasted. It's still going on, isn't it? Just to cap this portion, because there's just too much for me. Ron became my master degree program just by sitting there, hanging out and talking shop, talking materials, talking commitment, making sense of Frank Stella, making sense of Nolan, making sense of Olitsky, making sense of, you know, lyrical abstraction, abstract American art. How about some jazz? How about some electronic music? How about some Lamont Young? Ron called me up, hey, I got a musician over here. He wants to play. I said, oh, cool. You got an amp? I said, yeah. Took the amp over there, met Lamont and his wife. He set the shit up, turned it on, and I'm sitting there waiting. I had blues bands from art school days. Terry Allen here we formed a blues band in Chenard. And we both continued making music up to today. I mean, we're still pretty much involved. But Ron knew this. He knew I was into music, and he certainly had an ear for it. But his ear went to where his brain went to, that science, electronics, and vibration. So the guy turns the amp on, set to like a 30 cycle hum, you know, just one of them nerve-wracking, you know, real just. And I'm waiting for this cat to plug in and, you know, start blowing, doing something with this amplifier. He sits down, his wife sets up this little light show, and I must say, that was the most difficult listening experience I had in my whole life. And I've listened to a lot of music. I just came off of working for a whole summer working with like a Fillmore thing down in LA we had, where every week we had all these incredible bands of the 60s, and it's just crazy. So I'm expecting, so about like 4 hours, you know, I said, there's something here, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but once I, you know, realized who Lamont Young was and what he was about and what he was doing, where he was coming from, which then, again, was point to Black Mountain College. The notions of music on that level, I understand now, that 40 cycle hum, whatever, is as universal from a fabricated perspective to what exists in the universe and the cosmos. And I must say, I've learned so much stuff from Ron that almost every day, a decision I've made in one way or another, I can point to Ron, you know, kind of dropped that little seed on me.
Well, Gary, these pieces really harken back to that first piece that you saw called Zigzag. There's a lot in terms of the color and optical effects of these paintings that really relate to his earliest work that we were aware of.
Well, at the time, remember, it was pop and op. That was what was the de rigueur of the day, pop and op. So Ron they didn't know what to do with him. Was he pop, was he op? I mean, that was the argument.
Gary, Can I say, that was amazing, everything that you just said. And I'd like to add to that you're right. But I do remember that my Ron told me that one of his very first pieces, which is about 16 inches wide, it's a circle, it's a target, and it's split into quarters, and it was right along there with that series, the Roll Your Own Zigzag series. I think it came first. I think it's 1962 or 3. But he looked at that piece too. That was part of his study. I should have mentioned it, because you nailed it, Gary. He came from there and came back home again.
Yes.
He came to the circle, he came to finding the center, he came to the color and these quarters. And it was called Target. And there's one piece in the series called Target Quarters. But that's exactly right. That was the part of the reason why he made the series. I also wanted to say, I wanted to ask Penny if, I heard you say, Gary, that something about Greenberg, Clement Greenberg, because Ron called himself an old-fashioned constructivist, and he did appreciate Greenberg, but Penny had a wonderful quote that she told me recently. I don't have it right with me. Okay, well, do you want to paraphrase? I'll paraphrase.
I don't think it would be the same if I paraphrased it, but I'd be happy to. You admit it, as Gary said, I don't have to do that, do I?
Yeah.
It helps for us old folks.
Okay, how does that sound? He was very conscious and proud and of the fact that he came from that Clement Greenberg, that minimalist kind of art and school. That was his starting. That was where he started. But he said, and we all know this is exactly what happened. He didn't stick with that because he said, that's where I came from, but I had to make it beautiful. And that's what he did. He spent his life doing that. And I've always loved Ron for that. He was a very good friend forever. So I'll give it back now.
Well, Ron was definitely highly conscious of our history. And the first gallery or dealer that I dealt with was Eugenia Butler in LA. And Eugenia Butler had a dinner for Ron Davis, Clement Greenberg, Ken Nolan, and Jules Olitsky. And they invited me for dessert. Now, I was making light pieces back then. This is still in the 60s. And Clem Greenberg was judging a painting competition where people just entered and they were either judged in or out. And he judged my work out, which is an extreme compliment to me. I kind of knew that was going to happen. And at that time, it was real important for Ron to be accepted by those New York artists, but not for me.
I can say, add a few more pieces to that. There was another round painting that Ron made in that same area as in time as Roll Your Own Zigzag. I think it was called Ballpoint Pen. It's circular. And another one of the sort of discovery paintings. You know, on the West Coast, those of us who didn't travel back to New York, we got a lot of our information from magazines, mostly Art Forum and Art in America. And so we were looking at pictures of New York paintings. And Ron was kind of a bridge because he was aware of them, and they became aware of his work. And so he brought some real life and real connections to that school, and painters like Stella and Darby Bannard. You know, Darby was a big influence, and Ron and I talked about Darby Bannard's paintings, and Ron named his son after Darby. So there was a learning curve there of becoming aware of what was going on the opposite coast. And New York at that time was pretty dismissive of almost everything that was happening in LA. And Ron became the exception, so.
Well, there was a thing now. Well, Ron as a painter, I want to express that this Stella here is just impeccable. Ron did turn it on its side. So, you know, he made a distinction that Ron made this, not Stella. But Ron's hand is in there. This Stella, I look at the edges of because Ron was then spoke up in a movement in LA called Hard Edge, right? The Lozer Feidelson and Helen Lunsberg, and then there's a group of elder first generation LA artists that were dealing with contemporary issues, were, as was then coined, the phrase hard edge. Ron was then thrown into that as well. So, but the use of tape then was a Frank Stella tool, and Ron also used tape for his hard edge, you know, to make the zigzag or a target or any of these lines. But here you can see his actual hand. In some of these paintings you can see his stroke. Those are painterly affections. They're not conceptual. You know what I'm talking about? He dabbed that shit in there. He didn't think about it. With all the other things, the pixelating, sending it out, having it fabricated, you know, for me, they were not painter things. They were painter, maybe ideas that came from his scientific mind. He was kind of like a scientist artist. The guy was brilliant. He cleared up all of that lecture garbled stuff that I got at art school. I took it in, but I didn't know what they were talking about. I just know it had something to do with painting. Ron, in my visitations, I didn't work for Ron. I just hung out with him. We smoked weed and talked and listened to music. And a lot of our talk, like I said, was shop talk, but a lot of it was, what does an American painter, how does an American painter act, commit? What do they see? What is it about? What is American abstraction about besides emoting? There's a science, there is a visual context that is solely intrinsic, like Greenberg, to itself. Painting, American painting, abstract painting, is intrinsic to itself. I think that's the basic and the foundation for anybody that's trying to understand painting on a formal level. And Ron most definitely understood it as he went through the permutations of his career and presented all the different aspects of how paintings can be presented, part of that great concept of his genius. But it also led him back to where painters originate, and that's making that mark. And they're in here, back on canvas. And for me, that's the coming back around to yourself and being able to make your expression with your hand and leave that mark as a significant signifier of the maker.
Gary, that reminds me that Ron always said that he wanted to create paintings. This is probably earlier in the 60s, 70s, but I see it here too, as you say, that he wanted to make a painting, for example, a Pollock in the style of a Mondrian, and a Mondrian in the style of a Pollock. A Pollock in a box is what he called some of his hard edge work, and he would put that painterly splattering and pouring as an homage to Pollock in there. And he tried to, and I think he succeeded, to do that in a new way that was American painting, but in this new Ron way.
Well, you know, everybody, well, a lot of people love to mush. And that's all painting is mushing. You know, and that's what you're going to mush and why. What and why and on what. You know, that's what it's all about.
There's a video here somewhere, I believe, I think it's in the corner by the door, of some videos of Ron that I took painting this series in the studio, and he's definitely mushing. He's really painting. He's putting his mark on the canvas with a paintbrush, and it's very dear, and I really love looking at that, because he worked hard to do that. So thanks, yeah, Gary. That's right on.
It's a hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do, but let me just emphasize the ideas. Let's go back to Let's Go. Let's go back to the beginning of Western aesthetic, right? So you got a cave drawings of animals and people and hunters and what we do, and here's our daily life and all that good shit, and we're all saying, wow, that's wonderful. He's telling us what it was like to be a caveman, being bison. And then here's this fool over here. He takes some powder, puts his hand up on the wall, just leaves a print. There's two different people that needed to express. One that I was here, one that I am here. The same expression from two different sources, actually saying gigantic things. But the idea is the need for man to make a mark. And in our Western tradition goes back to the cave, to that person that wanted to do that. And we haven't really gone far from that. We might have changed, you know, but one good idea, and Ron said, you got a good idea, you're doing all right. You got a good idea, use it, milk it. You get two good ideas, you're a genius. You know? You get three good ideas, you're probably in an insane asylum. It's just too much to bear. But, you know, I mean, little things like that come up and you think about it, sticks, and you say, oh yeah, huh? The mark, that's the beginning and the end of it all for a painter in that tradition that I just expressed.
Okay. Penny, have you got any more comments?
You guys are great. I'm so amused. This is a fantastic talk, and I'm enjoying it 100%. I'm sure everybody else is too.
Are we going to do Q&A?
Yeah, let's do some Q&A.
Can I, one more little diatribe, please? The last time I saw Ron was here in Taos. And what had happened was we had talked about Hogans and being able for the artist to see his vision wherever they went. In other words, once you develop the eye, you see it everywhere, and you recognize it, and you file it in your aesthetic file back there. And Ron would talk about Hogans and talk about Uccello and all this, and he would see his images in it, and he pointed out. But when I came up and I saw Ron the last time up in, on the mesa, the first thing I saw was his sculpture. The Frank Gehry was, for me, that was his sculpture. Up here, the Hogan was what he talked about. That shape, you know, everything else, but that shape and what it can do as a shape. In that visit, he gave me this. And I carry that around. This is from the blood of Christ, Santa Sangre, Sangre de Cristo, the mountain up there on the mesa. He says these come out of they're natural. He did drawings of it. He gave me that, and what this represented to me was, finally I understood that science and spirituality are the same. In this piece, I see everything Ron made, everything Ron is about. And this was the last thing he did.
It's a starlight crystal. They're found in very few places on the earth. One of them is northern New Mexico. And Ron loved them, and he gave them out to people he loved.
That's all I got.
Okay.